Hello. Like many, I'm a filmmaking obsessive. Alongside my professional work, I also do lots of experimental work, usually short films, but also special effects cinematography. Before computer graphics came along, this is how everything was done, practically. And I've dedicated a lot of time in trying to master the ways of old in a do-it-yourself setup. Not always succeeding, but learning along the way. Over the years, I've obsessively researched the practical techniques involved in bringing some of the most influential pieces of cinema to screen. From 2001: A Space Odyssey to Blade Runner to Star Wars. This bold science fiction imagery is pervasive in terms of its influence on modern culture. We often take it for granted, but the artists who built these worlds back in the day started with a blank slate. Things were designed, built, and in the old days before computer graphics, were largely photographed. In this little film, I want to talk about a technique born from that era, which I think is possibly one of the most important, but largely invisible, foundations when it comes to world building on screen, and one that you've likely never given too much thought to. I want to talk about kitbashing. You might have heard the term greebly used, which apparently can be attributed to George Lucas whilst he was directing that idea of a used universe in the Star Wars aesthetic. But broadly speaking, it's all the same thing. Adam Savage describes the technique as to take pieces of model kits and use them to add detail and scale and scope to models that you're creating for the film industry. If you scan the surface of an iconic film spaceship such as the Millennium Falcon, you'll notice hundreds if not thousands of tiny mechanical looking pieces, which from a distance you assume is all part of the workings of the ship. Engine parts, vents, pipes, laser guns. But in the design and construction of these studio models, these pieces were pillaged extensively from model kits of the era. They bear no connection with spacefaring whatsoever. What you actually see on the surface of the Millennium Falcon are shapes from the real world. World War II tank parts, artillery parts, motorsport engines, lorry axles. In the heyday of practical special effects in the 70s and 80s at Industrial Light and Magic, the model shop would have entire walls of these model kits from manufacturers such as Tamiya, Hasegawa and Airfix for the artists to pillage from, which they would then bash together in order to make something new and unique. The technique has been around for years, really since the beginning of industrial plastic injection moulding. You'll see it as far back as in Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the surface of the Discovery starship, and indeed the gigantic space station above Earth, were adorned with detailing to sell purpose and scale, often from available model kits of the day. That is the essence of kitbashing, and it's probably one of the most important techniques in constructing the cinematic worlds we all know and love, particularly in science fiction and fantasy. From the Discovery, the Falcon, the cityscapes of Blade Runner, even the lightsaber itself, which was bashed together from a vintage camera flash. The set design of Ridley Scott's seminal sci-fi horror Alien is festooned with this repurposing technique. The gothic, claustrophobic corridors of the Nostromo are peppered with used industrial heritage, creating a futuristic atmosphere, which is at the same time familiar but also deeply unsettling for the viewer. The James Cameron sequel, Aliens, even used discarded RAF helicopter engines as interior set dressing. This process of repurposing the familiar, those real-world objects and representations of industrial and mechanical artefacts, such as model kit parts or thrift store items, to shape into props, buildings, set dressing and vehicles, things you've never seen before, is the essential groundwork for this cinematic imagination of the last 50 years. And I would argue it goes much, much deeper than spaceships and set architecture. Even the otherworldly sounds we hear in our favourite films are largely repurposed in the same way. They're in essence bashed from the real world, like the model kit parts of a World War II vehicle on the surface of a spaceship. Star Wars sound designer Ben Burtt was a master of this. He'd record all kinds of strange and wonderful real-world industrial sounds and repurpose them together through his mixing desk to create those sci-fi and fantasy sounds we're so familiar with, from the Millennium Falcon starting up, to the lightsaber, to the sound effects of Indiana Jones films. But I think this technique of repurposing goes even deeper, if you'll allow me to get more abstract for a moment. The aesthetic of Star Wars is iconic. The idea of a used universe was famously spearheaded by Lucas and brought into colour by concept artists Ralph McQuarrie and Joe Johnston, bringing a unique feeling to the sets and props, which we can usually point at and agree is so Star Wars in its look, the faded look and wear signs. Indeed, if something doesn't bear those classic used universe hallmark, it can often be quite controversial in the setting. But even the storyline of Star Wars itself, and other imaginative world-building cinema we're familiar with, is a product of this repurposing method, I would argue. I mean, it's a widely known fact that when writing Star Wars, Lucas was influenced by the mythology and heroic legend tropes that permeate through cultures across the globe. Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey is often quoted as the direct inspiration for Star Wars' plot, but it's probably more likely that the structuralist ideas within Campbell's research aligned with the subconscious ideas burning inside Lucas from all of the pop culture he'd absorbed as a youth. He also took in other film genres such as westerns, notably the films of John Ford and the iconic samurai films of Akira Kurosawa, into his melting pot of ideas to repurpose and produce something aesthetically unique, to bash together something we've never seen before. The swooping shots of X-Wings and TIE fighters battling in space were inspired by repurposed edits of newsreel footage from World War II dogfight battles above Europe and the Pacific that Lucas had assembled for his fledgling special effects crew in the mid-70s. So I think the kitbashing method, those tiny repurposed parts adorning the surfaces of vehicles from science fiction we all know and love, are kind of emblematic techniques of the imagination of fantasy and sci-fi storytelling that's created those iconic worlds we all know and love. That is, the taking of something familiar and repurposing it, bashing it, if you like, to create the imaginative aesthetic of galaxies and worlds far, far away.